this computer. Yes, I did it. Rebecca, thank you so much, Dr. Trumbull. Appreciate you being here. Please take it away.
Thanks, Shay. Thanks so much for having me. Need to do that quick double check. Can you all see the screen share? You got my slides? Perfect. I am going to run through this presentation relatively quickly. I have like the 10-minute version of it that doesn't have many details at all. This is the sort of in between. I've got the 40-minute version of it where I get to like lay out everything in detail. This is the sort of in between, which means that hopefully I found the right balance to give you some real detail for those who don't have experience with the DSA, don't know much about it, to get a better, clear sense of what's there. But undoubtedly, you're still going to have a ton of questions afterwards. So as Shay said, use those breakout groups to say to each other, what crazy thing was she talking about? Undoubtedly, I'm going to say a bunch of confusing, crazy things here. So prep those questions, come back to them. I'm always happy to answer. But the truth is, a lot of the things that I'm going to be talking about today, we don't actually have crystal clear answers to just yet. So I'm going to try to point out a number of areas where we don't exactly know where things are going, suggest in a couple of instances what I suspect is going to happen. But in many cases, this is a bit more than pure speculation, sort of educated speculation, given the work that I've been doing. But I just wanted to emphasize at the outset that we don't know everything just yet about the Digital Services Act and researcher data access under the Digital Services Act. Just for a very brief, sort of a little bit of context for you, for those I haven't met before, I am an associate professor at George Washington University. A part of my life is doing very traditional political communication online and digital political communication research. I study all of the bad things online, hate speech, harassment. I'm a ton of fun at parties. But because I want to try and do that work and do it better, one of the things that has interested and perplexed me for quite some time now is access to better data for researchers to do independent inquiries into the sorts of things that I study, but many, many, many other questions. And so I have been working a bit more in another sort of hat that I wear in my day-to-day life. I've been working much more in the policy arena as well, and particularly with the European Commission. I actually got this work started when I was an assistant professor at Leiden University in the Netherlands, and really data access questions started coming up under the context of the General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR. And so I've been working on GDPR issues with the European Commission and with researchers and with platforms. And then I've been working with all of those same actors under the context of the Digital Services Act. So I'm a bit of a strange beast, which is how I get to talk to you about all of these things today. All right, let's jump into it. I'm going to start off with my TLDR. Few key points here that I want you to keep in mind throughout my presentation. First is that we're actually already seeing some progress on researcher data access thanks to the DSA. But secondly, and honestly, I think even more importantly, we need to keep in mind that when we're talking about legal mandates and something as complex as the Digital Services Act, it's always going to be sort of something that develops over time. We're not going to see the full system fleshed out and available to us instantaneously. So I have some recommendations for researchers and I have some recommendations for platforms. These are fairly broad in my TLDR. For researchers, the first expectation is the first exhortation is for you to manage expectations. The second is to be patient. And the third, and actually I think the most important, is to plan now, start planning now for cooperating with one another across jurisdictions, across fields, and so on. Really, the only way researcher data access under the DSA is going to function properly is if we do, in fact, build deep collaborations with one another. For companies, my mainline recommendations are to take these mandates seriously, And second, to work with the new independent intermediary body. I'll talk a little bit more about that in this presentation, but this is one of those areas where the long version, I'd be able to give you all the details. This medium version, I can't tell you everything. So ask me all sorts of questions if you have them. Let's take a step back now. Let me tell you a little bit about what's actually in the Digital Services Act. The most important article when it comes to researcher data access is, of course, Article 40, which applies to very large online platforms and very large online search engines. I pronounce it VLOPs and VLOSs. Other people say it different ways. Whatever, say what you want. There are currently 25 different services that have been designated as VLOPs and VLOSs. So you see the list here. It covers a wide range of services, and note that this is at indeed the digital service level. So Google has a number of separate services, Microsoft as well. Note that there are a number of porn sites that are included in this. So it sort of runs the gamut of digital services. Article 40 covers data access provisions for academic and civil society researchers, allowing them to gain access to study so-called systemic risks that are posed to societies within Europe or across Europe. Researchers under Article 40 might also study the effectiveness of potential risk mitigation measures, maybe some that these services have actually implemented, or it could be others that researchers think are promising, but they want to test those. There are two key elements within Article 40, two key subsections. The first is Article 40.12, which mandates that the platforms, the VLOPs and VLOSs, provide access to real-time public data to those same sorts of civil society and academic researchers. And it's actually been in effect since August of 2023. Article 40.4 is actually the one that I think most people think about when they start thinking about Article 40, but 40.12, right, is also really important. So I'm going to discuss both today. But Article 40.4 is the one where researchers can submit bespoke requests for data to their digital services coordinators of jurisdiction. So that includes for access to private data, not just public data. Crucially, this part of Article 40 is not actually yet in effect. Why is that? Well, because it requires a delegated act. And for those roughly familiar with the US policymaking system, this is more or less equivalent to the rules-making process that we might expect from federal agencies in the US, although Supreme Court decisions, that's maybe a little bit less relevant. But in any case, this is the European Commission giving some additional color to the very high-level language that exists in Article 40 in the main act itself. Now, every time I've given this presentation, I've had to change this sub-bullet point. I was looking at the last one I did just before this meeting, and it said, expected next week or maybe the week after, fingers crossed. That was over a month ago. So now we know for certain the Delegated Act will not be out this summer. We're expecting it in the fall, hopefully early fall. But don't quote me on any of this except that it's not coming immediately, because every time I've said and have heard from my colleagues at the European Commission what they're thinking, it's turned out to be wrong. It's been delayed for one reason or another. So the good news is that a number of platforms are actually responding to, in particular, Article 40.12. Here, just a quick sort of evaluation of the companies that at least have somewhere on their website that they have a sentence or two that says, yes, indeed, we've set up a researcher data access program. These little check marks don't require that we've verified that the companies have done anything super meaningful. This is just an indication they've said, yes, this thing actually exists. The plus and minus combination signs that you see for the Apple App Store and for Booking.com Those are there because both of those platforms have ad repositories, but they don't actually have anything that we've been able to find that seems directly responsive to Article 40.12. So the ad repositories get us a little bit there, but those are mostly existing, and they certainly don't meet the full expectations under Article 40.12. Of course, there are a number of services that haven't yet provided anything, at least not that we've been able to dig up. Now, I've showed you a lot of green marks, green check marks, but quite frankly, a lot of the programs are at this stage still quite a mess, and that's me being generous. Often the fact that these programs even exist is really hard to discern. I'm able to give you those check boxes because I have a team at my institute that has spent time digging into websites and going over policies and finding the little hidden sentence here and there. In some cases, we have missed those, but if that's the case, it's because it's become, it's effectively nearly impossible to find. When researchers have been applying to many of these programs, they have reported back to the Coalition for Independent Technology Research in their public reports or directly to the Commission that they found the rules really, really confusing, that the applications have been very, very confusing, and in particular, that the review procedures from the various services with these programs has been incredibly slow. When researchers have gotten outcomes, whether positive or negative, but of course, particularly for negative outcomes, when they've been denied access to the data, often they're not given a clear reason why that's the case. And for a lot of these programs, while they've said they have new programs related to Article 40.12, it's also clear they're not providing access to real-time data as required under the law. So it's not nothing that these things exist, but being able to make practical use of much of this data is still what feels like a relatively distant potential accomplishment. Now, the European Commission has actually stated publicly in a number of different venues that they view Article 40.12 as permissioning researchers, again, in academia and civil society, to scrape publicly available data from any of the VLOPS or VLOS services. The European Commission has also launched a number of inquiries or information requests. So in the spring, they actually asked all of the VLOPS and VLOSs for additional information about the programs that they had developed. And then they opened formal investigations. The one that we know is outstanding involves Meta for potential non-compliance with 40.12. And if you all were paying attention to the news at the end of last week, although there were quite a few things going on at the end of last week, on Friday, the Commission announced that it has found X in violation of the DSA. And one of the specific areas is that they are in violation of researcher data access provisions, specifically 40.12. There are a number of organizations that have been stepping in to try and provide additional information to researchers. So I will note, and I'm happy to share these slides, Shay, if you want to circulate them afterwards, so you all can actually click on this link. But the institute that I run at George Washington University has created this tracker so that researchers can more readily, easily find the links to these specific programs as they're announced by each of the services. I'm also the co-founder of the Coalition for Independent Technology Research, and we have a really amazing group that's come together to set up what we're calling the Coalition Data Access Audit and Survey. We would love for researchers who, whether you've actually applied for these programs or not, to take the survey, and we're now moving to a phase where we're doing more in-depth interviews with researchers who've been trying to make use of 40.12 to better learn from their experiences. A couple of initiatives that I don't have on my slides. The Mozilla Foundation has been working particularly with civil society organizations to learn more about their experiences and to advocate in this space. The Algorithmic Transparency Watch, right, has been doing quite a bit as well. So lots of independent efforts to try and make sure that this new legal regime does have some legs and is robust and is providing the promise that we have all hoped for. So now I'm going back to Article 40.4, right? 40.12 is technically in effect, while 40.4 is not yet. Let me give you some of the basics about what we expect for 40.4 when it does in fact go into effect. So first we need the Delegated Act. We anticipate it will be released in the fall. There will be a public comment period, review, and there has to be a vote by the Parliament for the Delegated Act. Then ultimately, once that's done, there's a 90-day period before it finally goes fully into effect. So right now, I don't think we're probably looking at 40.4 being in effect until the beginning of 2025, but I could be wrong about that. We'll see. So once it is in effect, who can apply? The short answer is that researchers who are affiliated with so-called research organizations as defined by the EU Copyright Directive. This is a separate law that the DSA refers back to under Article 40 to help define who are qualified researchers. Now, if you look at the EU Copyright Directive, essentially what it says is organizations with a substantial research remit. We know that academic institutions will fall under it without any sort of problem. Where the line lies, and it's nonprofit organizations, where the line lies for CSOs, civil society organizations, is something that we anticipate that either the Delegated Act will address or the DSCs or the European Commission will provide some more guidance on as we go. But we don't know whether that is going to include non-European institutions. That's very much up in the air. The Delegated Act could resolve that, but I honestly think it's probably unlikely that it will resolve that, primarily because in this sort of rules-making process, usually the Commission is hesitant to kind of, in the Delegated Act, develop what might be seen as new interpretations of law. They'd rather do the interpretation, right, in a different sort of way. But given that, right, and that we may not have true clarity right off the bat about who qualifies, whether non-European researchers and research institutions apply, this really drives home the point that collaborations are going to be particularly important. You know, and I'll tell you that the European Commission is very concerned, and as I've been talking to the digital services coordinators at the member state level, they're very much concerned that that there will be sort of equal and equitable access to data under this regime. And so when we're talking about research organizations, whether they're CSOs or academic institutions in less resourced countries, helping institutions that can help, that are better resourced, that can help with capacity building will be certainly looked on very favorably by the regulators in this context. So let's say we now know we've got researchers, definitely qualified researchers who can apply for data. What is it that they can actually apply for? Well, in some ways, the sky's the limit. Not quite true, but it is actually a fairly open regime. Remember that I said in an earlier slide that the scope here is European systemic risks and potential mitigation measures for those risks. It's very much possible that there are risks that are emerging from other jurisdictions that also apply to Europe, right, or vice versa. The Digital Services Act itself lays out some names, some systemic risks, but not all systemic risks. And both the Commission and the Digital Services Coordinators, the DSCs, have said very clearly that they want for these risks to remain fairly nebulous, because they want this, in other words, they don't want to give a really defined, a really precise definition to these things, precisely because they want this law to be responsive to changing needs, emerging risks, emerging concerns over time. The Article 40 does note that these data requests must be proportionate. Again, we hope to have some additional clarity from the Delegated Act. But if we don't get that, then certainly in practices, as the digital services coordinators are reviewing the applications, we'll start to get more information about what, in fact, is proportionate. The data must exist in the first place, and this is a spot where we think it's going to be very important for researchers, regulators, and companies alike to be in very clear dialogue with one another about what does and does not exist, what can be created, what can't. It shouldn't jeopardize trade secrets. We do anticipate that the Delegated Act is going to define what's meant by trade secrets. And when we're talking about jeopardizing trade secrets, it may not actually mean that if a trade secret is involved, that researchers can't have access to that data. But in fact, there would be a much higher bar for the sort of safeguards and, let's say, contractual arrangements that would have to be in place to protect those. And of course, the access to the data and the processing of that data must comply with GDPR. What do we think the application process is likely to look like? This is one of the areas where we have the kind of biggest question marks until we get into it, until the regulators really lay this out for us. We don't know for sure. But Andrew Gruen, who's on the call, and I worked together with a number of regulators, researchers, and companies to run a pilot test of this. And so we have some ideas about what we think works and what doesn't work. And would suggest at a fairly high level that it's likely that the first step will be for researchers to submit an application to their local digital services coordinator. So if you're at a French university, you would probably submit, if the leading researcher or research groups are at a French university, they would probably submit to the French digital services coordinator. That local DSC, in the scenario that I just gave you, the French DSC, might send the application to what I referred to before as this independent intermediary body, which again, Andrew, who's on the call, has been working with me through the European Digital Media Observatory. I've been leading a working group, of multi-stakeholder working group of platform representatives, researchers from both academia and civil society, as well as governance experts, to set up this new organization that will essentially sit between all of the key actors here and do some of the hard things, like provide independent expert and peer reviews of the proposals that the researchers are submitting, because frankly, the regulators won't have that expertise in-house, and both platforms and researchers recognize that it's better for independent researchers to be evaluating these things than for the platforms to do it themselves, for a variety of different reasons we could talk about later. So after the intermediary body would give a recommendation, not a final decision, legally it's only the regulators that can make a final decision, they would send that recommendation back to the local digital services coordinator, and the local, local DSC would make their own recommendation and then forward that to the DSC of establishment. What does that mean? In most instances, it's the Irish. It's the member state regulator in the member state where the actual digital service is established. Vast majority of cases, this is Ireland, but not in every case. So let's say everybody's in agreement. The Irish say, yes, let's go forward with that. Excuse me. They make their final decision. And if that's positive, they would then designate the researchers who have applied as so-called vetted researchers and make a reasoned request to the platforms. So then the last step is for the platforms to respond. And under the DSA, they have just 15 working days to do so. They can object because they don't have the data or on trade secret grounds. And at that point, we would anticipate that there is a negotiation process. A third-party negotiator could even be brought in to assist with that negotiation process. That's it. All right, all of these different steps to bring together this complex system. But we don't yet know precisely how it will work in action. We'll gain a lot more information when we have the delegated act. We'll also have a better sense of what are the additional gaps that need to be filled in. But even in this state where we don't know everything, we know a lot, and we know some key things about how researchers can help, what platforms can be thinking about doing as well. So my call to researchers is, especially on 40.12, to provide feedback to the regulators, in this case, provide feedback, most importantly, to the European Commission itself. Do so by writing public reports, releasing those truly publicly, not sharing them just privately. They're of much greater benefit, and the Commission can do more with them when they're shared more widely. Participate in that data access audit that I highlighted a minute ago, excuse me. And as I noted earlier, I think the most important thing in all of this is that researchers cooperate with one another. Why? Well, because there's capacity building needs here, but even more importantly than that, this whole system is likely going to entirely break down if what we've got is 1,000 different researchers coming at the system, sending in their individual applications, asking for a bespoke need for a bespoke data set for a bespoke research project. That will simply overwhelm the system. So cooperating with one another to make some sense of what we might ask for together is really important. And this is where we think that independent intermediary body is actually the most crucial to the entire system. Yes, the intermediary body is going to be set up to help develop capacity for just reviewing the applications, to bringing in independent expert peer reviews. But one of the other things the independent intermediary body will be intended to do, and we're within weeks, maybe a couple of months of setting up this organization as a legal entity. One of the first things that the intermediary body will do is set up a number of convenings to help get researchers together to try to identify common use data sets and to prioritize data needs, so we can make larger sense out of the system, right? So the platforms actually know from the start, here's some key things that they can produce, go in. But the more we cooperate with one another on identifying these shared priorities and needs, the more likely it is that we're actually in practice going to be able to get the data, and relatively quickly. And then last but not least, have patience, because even in the scenario that I just described, it will take time to achieve data access. How can companies help in this scenario? Join and cooperate with the independent intermediary body. This is a stakeholder-led organization, or it's an organization where stakeholders are multiple types of stakeholders are going to be brought together. So we need companies to come to the organization to work with us to set common standards, and frankly, to interact with researchers, right? So we can do better at understanding each other's needs and what's possible. And frankly, from a very practical perspective, we think that the work that an independent intermediary body will be doing is going to overall reduce the workload and burden inside the companies. Right? This is an organization that will be able to scale, develop review processes and things that the companies themselves don't have internal expertise for. So that's it. I could have gone on for another half an hour, but I'm leaving it there. I anticipate I've left you with a ton of questions. So Shay, I'll let you take it back over and tell them what's next.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording real quick.